For our COBT viewers and listeners, it's Maynard, Mike, and John Summers here to talk about California. You know, one of the things we love about COBT is we're always watching for interesting analysis, interesting people, thought pieces that come to light that we find very interesting. And that happened to us recently. A study of California gasoline prices was put out by Professor Michael Mische. He is an almost 30-year veteran. I think it's 27 years, 10 months, something like that. But he is an almost 30-year veteran of the USC's Marshall School of Business. In addition to his distinguished academic career, he's also had a long career in consulting. He's helped many, many participants, industrial, energy, and otherwise, think about their strategy and their long-term planning. So many prominent names in that list of clients. But let me just stop here and say, Professor Mische, we're so glad that we tracked you down. We're so glad that you wrote this report. We're even more glad we get to talk to you about it. So thank you for your work and thank you for joining us.
Terrific to be here. Thanks for hunting me down, and thank you for the nice compliments on the work in my career. Truly appreciate it.
Well, it's a wonderful piece. We'll get into it. It's really extensive and it was a lot of fun to read. But, you know, we are energy nerds here, Professor Mische. Mike Bradley, what would you tell us before we jump in and talk California gasoline?
Well, I mean, the screen is green today. I mean, so yeah, it's Kermit the Frog green. I mean, it's so green, right? Nice. You know, broader equities up around 2% on Trump's EU tariff extension. Bond yields down about 8 or 10 basis points on Japanese bond yields plunging. WTI crude oil is down about $1 to around $61 a barrel. I think there's some issues about OPEC Plus coming up there. And energies are kind of a mixed bag. So from the standpoint of what's going on with bonds today, you know, May consumer confidence came up. They had a reading of 98. That was the biggest, it's the largest monthly increase in like 4 years. So it's totally unexpected. And, you know, so that kind of blew people away. You know, I think as we think about the rest of this week, you're going to have the PCE price index come out, FOMC minutes come out, and as well as personal income and spending. So there's a couple of economic stats left to go. But I think the point, you know, the other point is that the 10 and 30-year bond, you know, they were down 8 or 10 basis points, even with that EU tariff extension, even with basically consumer confidence. And the question would be, why are bond yields not up substantially today? Well, it's because, like I said, Japanese bond yields fell quite significantly here over the last 2 days. We talked about this in our, you know, our weekly market wrap about this Japanese, yen carry trade. That's starting to come back into the fold of things. And so that got markets a little bit disoriented. That looks like it's coming back into some sort of normalcy. So that's what happened with bonds. As far as crude oil, I think the things that we're watching is OPEC Plus is going to be meeting on May 31st rather than June 1st, a little bit earlier. And the question is, are they going to increase July production increases by another 411,000 barrels a day like they did in May and June? I think consensus is it probably will. If they don't, then you're probably going to see crude oil rally pretty significantly on that. And I think the second thing that's affecting crude oil is just you've got these Iranian nuclear talks going on in Rome right now. There seems to be some optimism coming out of there. If the deal can be reached, obviously oil sanctions will probably come off, which means more crude oil, you know, onto the markets, which means prices probably under some pressure. But I generally think that will, you know, I think people, you know, who knows where people are right now, but I don't think that's going to affect the market as much as Saudi and OPEC Plus putting barrels in the market. I mean, if they put another 400,000, that's 1.2 million barrels over the last 3 months versus expectations around 300 or 400,000. So that's into basically a market that is way oversupplied. I think from a policy standpoint, the things that stood out to me were last week, the GOP, passed his House bill, his House tax bill. And the thing that stood out to me is that they gutted that bill, you know, solar renewable subsidies, and those solar stocks got pounded last week. Now, obviously, what we're hearing now is the Senate, there's going to be it's going to be tough to get it through the Senate. It sounds like from people we talked to that the Senate is not completely on board with these subsidy cuts, and so maybe we have some of those go back in. So solar stocks got crushed. Maybe they get to rebound, but you know it's going to be tough to get to the finish line here. So something to think about. I think as far as last week that stood out to me, maybe in the electricity and energy markets, was Trump's executive orders for nuclear. I think he had 3 or 4 executive orders. Those stocks, those SMR stocks, were up on average 40% last week. Some of them were up even more. And so, that was interesting. The other thing that was interesting, that kind of went under the radar screen, was MISO capacity auction prices. Those came in at, summer capacity auction prices were $666 a megawatt versus $30 a megawatt during last year's summer. I think the annual was like $220 a megawatt. That is a massive increase in MISO. That went under the radar. And I think that what that tells us, and we saw the same thing happen in PJM over the last year, prices are going up. Supply and demand, what the market's telling you, there is going to be a big mismatch. And so this is the big problem. And so we'll see how things develop. Now, as far as the last thing we wanted to say, maybe just kind of an introduction to our guests, is I just want to hit on these California refinery closures, just to give you some stats. California refining capacity is roughly 1.6 million barrels a day. Phillips 66 is closing their LA refinery. That's about 145,000. And Valera's closing the Mische refinery. That's about 145,000 as well. So you have almost 20% of capacity is going to be taken out over the next 6 to 12 months in that market. And so that should be a good lead into what John's going to say and what our guest is going to say today.
Awesome. There's a lot going on. Well, John, I don't know if people know this in your background. You lead our investing efforts at Veriton, but you have been a California oil and gas man in your life. So This show is just right up your alley.
No, I couldn't be more excited, and couldn't be more excited that Professor Mische is joining us here today.
Michael, let's jump in. Thanks again for joining us. There's a lot in here, a lot of interesting facts and figures around California. And even though it's entitled A Study of California Gasoline Prices, in some ways it's a study of the oil and gas complex in California, because you talk about production, you talk about pipelines, refining, and then of course talk about gasoline and peculiarities to the gasoline markets in California. Maybe one big picture question as we jump in is, what's been the reception to the study? Well, first of all, what led you to do it, to tackle this? And then what's been kind of the reception? Are you like on every California talk show, radio show, podcast, or are people trying to ignore what is a very insightful piece of work?
Well, let's take it one at a time. I got into this a long time ago, back in the 70s, 1973, with the Arab oil embargo in October, with the Arab-Israeli war, and I was fascinated over the impact of gasoline prices at the time and gasoline shortages. So I was an undergraduate then, and I studied under a brilliant economist. His name was Alexander Melamed. He was doing econometrics at that time on that subject, pulled me under his umbrella, and from that day on, I've had a love affair with the industry. Not necessarily the industry itself, but the economics of the industry, how it operates, and supply, demand, and pricing, and then also the role of regulation. So my academic interest goes back 50 plus years. On the reception side, I would suspect it depends on which side of the aisle you're on. Among industry experts, including those on Wall Street, the reception has been extraordinarily wonderful. Been a lot of good feedback, a lot of this is a solid study, and then of course on the political side, particularly aligned with California policies. It's sort of the study from hell, if you have it. And so I've gotten both sides on the reception. But as I tell people, look, the data is the data, the study is the study, the math is the math. The fact that the results and the conclusions don't satisfy a particular political narrative, well, that's not my problem. If these results and come across and come down saying there was price gouging, there was price manipulation, there was supply manipulation, and all of that, I'm sure I would be in Sacramento getting an award today for that. But the data doesn't support it, and it's never supported it. But you don't have to believe my study. You can take a look at the California Attorney General. He's looked at it 7 or 8 times over the last 25 years and hasn't come up with refiner malpractice or refiner bad actors. Same way with the Federal Reserve, also the FTC, and I believe the Ninth Court had a case on it. So it's not just Professor Mische pointing to that. There are other collaborative agencies that point to that.
I wonder, Professor Mische, as we were going through the report, I think there's a tendency sometimes to see things that don't make sense and to assume, well, people must not realize what they're doing. But then when you go through the report, you suggested at one point, it's like, well, actually, these are smart people. They know what they're doing. And you point the finger at, we would really like to eliminate the oil and gas complex in California because we would really like to have, this is part of an energy transition away from oil and gas. So these choices are quite deliberate. So I've been a subscriber to the former, and after your paper, I've wondered about the latter. How much of this is happening deliberately and with the full knowledge, do you think, of the state towards a different goal versus we just don't realize how many problems we're causing our own people with these regulatory and environmental regulations?
Well, I can't buy the second part of that argument that they don't understand what's being created and what hasn't been created. Okay, there are far too many people in Sacramento on the government payroll as analysts, administrators, bureaucrats, professionals that should be studying this and should have an objective eye as to the consequences of policy and the consequences of regulation. So I really can't buy that part. But I think...
So sorry, Professor Mische, so you mean to say there's no way they don't know what the implications of their own policies?
I absolutely think they know the implications of their policy. And the reason why I say that is even the statements of the governor himself and the chairwoman of CARB and a few other leaders in Sacramento have said, look, our objective is to have clean air and to ban this very bad industry in some form or another. And the way we get there is through high prices. We'll drive these prices up to such high levels of excruciating pain for the consumer that they'll beg to get out of their gas-powered automobiles. And I think, we're starting to see that. But, the oil company executives also recognize that. Mike Wirth has come out and said a few times about California policies, the CEO of Chevron, being extraordinarily expensive and restrictive to planning and capital investment. So, I think this is clearly a long-term engineering aspect or aspiration of the state under the current administration.
And do you think the people of California, do they realize, because sometimes, again, this is an outsider's perspective, they travel around the country, they know prices are cheaper in Kansas, and you pick a state. California has some of the highest cost gasoline and electricity in the country. So why do they subscribe to it? What do they think? Because you can't change the global climate by taxing yourself like this. Like, why do the voters support all this, or do they?
Well, you can't change the global climate just because you're changing California or trying to regulate California environmental standards. But I think with respect to the California voter, I think it's quite complex. California voters are conditioned, to a lot of incremental changes. And so we tend to think in small increments. Oh, it's only a 5% increase. Oh, what's 10% to improve the quality of air? Oh, what's another 5% or a few more millage on the property tax, for the children and things like that. So I think we're quite conditioned to a lot of incremental increases, and we're sort of oblivious to the compounding effect of that. So I think that's number one. I think also number two is California is relatively, it's a single party state. And so there's a supermajority in the legislature. So any opposing voice gets shouted down relatively quickly. And I think that in itself, is quite a concern. But I think overall, and I hate to say this, but these are complex issues. And people are concerned about just making their payment today. Can they make their rent? Can they pay their mortgage? Can they send their kids to school? They leave the complex issues to other people to solve and to figure out. And so I think a lot of folks just simply defer to what's the easiest narrative to understand. And that's, that's understandable because California is literally the most expensive state in the country to live in.
So
it's hard for somebody, I'm sorry, like my students graduate. And if they're not native Californians, they came from some other state or some other country, and they're trying to start a life here in California. How do they do that in a state that has the highest income taxes, the highest energy costs, and the highest home costs? So it is very difficult.
So I'm just kind of thinking about this, the complexity point, but also the simplicity point. You point in the paper, you can go through all sorts of, I'm not saying you do, but the average person can go through all sorts of theories as to why gasoline costs more. But then it's quite clear that California is just taxing it more, just the state tax, if you just know that number. So not to weave it all together in a big mess, but if in the next governor campaign, someone says, I'm going to cut our gasoline tax in half. I'm taking X cents off of every gallon of gasoline sold in the state, period. That's happening. Even if people don't understand why gasoline costs more, couldn't they understand? Do you think we're going to see something like that? Because so much of this is just a direct cost from the state.
Well, I think that's going to be very difficult for anybody coming in. I mean, it's a great aspiration to have. And if you cut it in half, it would be about the average for the nation, by the way. So we're double the average in state excise tax. Our state excise tax is almost 60 cents a gallon. It'll probably go to 62 or 63 on July 1st. That tax has nothing to do with gasoline. The basis of that tax is the California Consumer Price Index. So there's been times when the price of gas has actually declined, but that component, the excise tax, has actually increased. So that particular tax is used by California for roads and streets at the local level and highways. But we have this incredible deficit, and we have incredible debt, a crippling debt on the shoulders of the state. So it would be hard to mitigate that tax, given the financial situation of the state. But your point is really interesting here. And I made this point to a colleague this morning. We were talking, and I said, if the price of crude oil went to zero, and I happen to agree with the analysis of OPEC and OPEC Plus, Saudi and OPEC Plus, adding a lot of barrels out into the world market. It sort of reminds me of the late 80s when kind of that occurred under Reagan. If the price of oil went to zero today across the country, California would still have the highest gasoline prices in the country because of the regulatory costs. And the regulatory costs are the taxes and the underground storage fee, cap and trade, LCSF, which is the low carbon fuel standard, the seasonal blend, and state and local taxes. So there's a layer upon layer upon layer. So if the price of crude went to zero, California would still have the highest priced gasoline in the country because of the regulatory tax that are levied on a gallon. Now, interesting, the state makes 60 cents a gallon. And I know you know, how much does a gas station operator make? Anywhere from 10 to 12, maybe 15 cents a gallon. The state makes, almost 6 times the amount of money per gallon of gas than the gas station operator. So, that's something I think for the California consumer to think about.
I think this is something we're always watching, which is how energy policies are affecting the health of your economy, right? And this theme comes up all around the world. And here's a sentence from your paper. Since 2018, more than 360 companies, such as Oracle, Tesla, Nissan, Toyota, Nestle, Hewlett Packard, et cetera, have exited the state. So you have this, this blow is being dealt the state quietly because of this. And it's not just energy, there's other regulatory and corporate burden that happens. But the other thing that you raise, which is fascinating, is the profound national security implications. Because California refineries provide aviation fuels, Arizona and Nevada, for the military, Arizona and Nevada are also linked into this complex. So there is here's a state, it's also the most dependent on foreign oil of any state in the country. So those two things, what it's doing to California's industrial base and the risk that the nation takes as a result of these policies, those two things stick out as whoppers. This is not just, unfortunately, a California problem.
Well, when we look at it, California produces or supplies 88% of the gasoline to Nevada. It also produces and supplies 48% of the gasoline to Arizona. Now, it's not California gasoline, it's more conventional fuels. But nonetheless, the refineries here produce that. We have no inbound pipelines from anywhere. Our pipelines go in one direction, and that's to Arizona and to Nevada. And I think there's one that might go to Utah. But the primary pipelines go to Nevada and Arizona. Now, we have Air Force bases, a lot of them in Arizona and Nevada. Our naval forces and Marine forces are located in Southern California. We still have military assets in Northern California. And of course, we have Vandenberg Air Force Base here, and we have Travis way up in Sacramento. So our refineries produce aviation fuel and diesel fuel and gasoline for those military installations. Now we're losing from 2023 to 2026, we will have lost 21% of our in-state refinery production capacity. And the issue is, okay, if you're going to lose that, where are you going to make it up from? And how much is it going to cost for you to make it up? And so those are two significant issues that we went forward and addressed that also in a subsequent paper. So there are national security implications here, which is why one of the action steps that we've identified was for the current Trump administration to take a serious look at that and intercede if necessary.
And what would they do just if they were in an interceding mood? What would you have them do?
Well, we've already seen the first intercession, and that was last week when the Senate, following the House, the Senate voted to uphold the ban on 2035, the ban on sale of gasoline-powered engines and vehicles. So and Trump will sign it. And that's also tailpipe emissions. So on May 5th, we had recommended that action be taken. And so we saw that first major intercession. The second would be, okay, we need these refineries, or we need refinery capacity, or we need another pipeline coming into the state. So I would think you might see federal intervention or along those lines.
Yeah, when I think about like retail expenditures, I think of the 3 Gs. It's like groceries, gasoline, and generation, right? I mean, that's what you're spending most of your money on, not just the average person. And I kind of understand California saying we want to eliminate fossil fuels. Okay, we're going to tax it to hell. But I get that, and we want to move everyone towards electricity. The problem with that plan is that electricity in California is going up quite dramatically. It's the highest in the U.S. as well. Do people, or do these councilmen, senators, whatever, do they understand there is a link between the two?
Well, I think if you took a look at the California Legislative Analyst Office report, it indicated that California utility prices are about 38% higher than the rest of the country. So we're paying that. And the component of that is the largest component of that price differential are the renewables. according to the legislative analyst's office. It's not my work, it's their work, right? It's not citing them. And I think, again, it's this incremental mindset. Well, it's only 5% more, it's only 10% more. Would you be willing to pay 14% more for cleaner air? Yeah, that 14% is now compounding to make it 38% higher than the national average. And you're right, there is the classic displacement effect of income. You have X amount of dollars per month, and there are sort of fixed expenditures, right? And as those fixed expenditures increase, the discretionary amount decreases. And so I believe we're starting to see that squeeze, and we'll be able to confirm that when we take a look at consumer credit, personal credit, default rates, credit card utilization, credit maximization type things over the next few months. But I would suggest they're probably pretty high by now already.
The other question I would ask is, I mean, I know Newsom and crew basically wanted to look at the refining companies, their pricing. And what I would say is, I mean, if you know the refining industry, we've been pretty much in trough conditions for the last 2.5, 3 years, right? And if you put the supply and demand, just normal type stuff over the next 12, 18 months, theoretically, that globally is going to be very, very tight. We'll see how that works out. If that's the case, prices are going to go up substantially from here. How do you think the governor, how do you think the legislature reacts to that? Are there going to be investigations, or how does that play out?
Well, in February 2023, I gave testimony to the Senate hearing on this particular subject about price gouging and prices in the industry. And one of the things I tried to bring forward was this is a wild industry. One of the things that anybody that studies it, that knows it, that works in it, we all know that it's boom or bust. When crude prices are high, the refiners make good money, particularly those that are complex. And Chevron has one of the most complex operations in California. So when we have those high crude prices and demand is high and we have complexity, we're going to have high margins. That doesn't mean they're sustainable. That just means they're high for a period of time. And so we didn't really have good earnings in the mid 15, 16, 17 period. They absolutely went through the floor during COVID. They shot back up as a COVID response, and we all knew that. We all had the V curves ahead of time, so we knew exactly what was going to happen. But the state reacted to that, and so what happened is they held a series of hearings on price gouging, of which was never proved. However, they did pass legislation to fund the Department of Petroleum Market Oversight. And so they put in capitation for the margins of the refiners. And they do publish information on profit per gallon, but they're very good at producing information on gross profit per gallon, not the net of the refinery. And so we've seen where the published numbers were 80, 90 cents a gallon at the gross. But as you know, as an analyst, and as I know, I get into the net and I can have negative, 32 cents, negative 38 cents. Now, as we know, we're in this big trough. I mean, I think, honestly, I haven't looked at the numbers in a couple of weeks, but I'm thinking 14 cents is a good number, at a per gallon, at a net number right now. And so it's difficult for them to sort of understand that I think that this is a boom or bust industry, and there's no gouging here. It's just the way the industry runs. And then also, I think because, refineries are complex things. I mean, look, they're not very pretty to look at, but they are really cool to understand. And so when you really sort of understand how, a hydrocarbon molecule, oil, can be made into a vast amount of products, including products that are in pharmaceuticals. Okay. Birth control pills have a hydrocarbon molecule in them. Asphalt, concrete, steel. You can't make any of this stuff. The screen on your cell phone. You can't make any of this stuff without petroleum. And so when you start to really understand how that oil goes through this very complex refining process, it's actually pretty cool. And then, it brings us to end products. And so does the legislature and the policymakers have an understanding of that? I would say, given their past actions and history, absolutely not. They have no clue how a refinery runs.
One of the things, and I think touching on asphalt, I think it's a great transition point, because I love the discussion on what happens to our Air Force bases, what happens to our broader military complex if all of our refineries shut down. It's a great comment. The other one that I'd love to just touch on very quickly is asphalt, and you mentioned it already, but the Valero refinery in Sacramento, if that shuts down, I believe at one point it was producing 45% of the asphalt in Northern California. How do you replace that kind of production, particularly in a place like California, where getting an air permit for an asphalt refinery has got to be, I don't know, a decade long?
No, I would say it's impossible.
Impossible.
I mean, a decade would be generous. But I think if you talk to most oil executives, company executives, refinery executives, they'll say not in their lifetime.
Yeah.
Would they anticipate one? It's a profound issue. If that refinery shuts down, where are you going to get the asphalt? I mean, do you really think a windmill is going to make it? Because the wind doesn't produce petroleum. So the sun doesn't produce petroleum. So you need the petroleum to create the asphalt. You need the petroleum to create the concrete. You need the petroleum to create the steel, among thousands of other products. But this is a primary, fundamental component of infrastructure. And as such, it needs to be respected, and it has to be preserved. And so this is very important for policymakers to understand. It's not just big bad oil. It's what you do with the oil, and you can't pave a road without it. So, that's a very cogent point, and I think one that all Californians should be very aware of.
And Professor, you and Maynard discussed some of the action items coming out of your analysis earlier. As an individual or to our podcast guests, how can we as members of the industry or interested parties form concepts or actions or change the policy? How do we as individuals try to change the policies of California?
Number one, I think just be more aware and be better informed. I tell my students, like, you don't have to agree with what you hear, but you have to be mindful about it. You have to be an intelligent voter, a voter or an individual voter who has taken the time to study the issues and understands the consequences of policy. And so you may or may not agree with that, but if you've taken the time to study those, then you're in a much better position to make an informed decision and vote. So I think the first action step is, honestly, just try to get a little smarter. Secondly, is understand what's going on. And third, really look to your own economics. My models have the price of gas going from $6.04 all the way up to $8.43. Do I want to be right? No, I don't. I really don't. I don't want to see $8.43 for gasoline in the state. Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Is it going to be more than it is today? Absolutely. You don't lose 21% of your production and not have consequences. You got to import the stuff from somewhere, and we can get into that later. So I think understand that what sounds good, look under, pull back the layers a little bit and look under those and ask yourself, what are the long-term consequences of this decision, and why am I paying such high gasoline prices, and why am I paying such high utility prices? And because you could be doing other things with your money. And I think that's what folks need to ask.
Absolutely. And given how long you've studied this topic in particular, and you just brought up the import question, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts there. And just for the listeners, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe Saudi Arabia and Iraq imported as much crude to California last year as they produced in state.
Yes. So at one time, we were one of the world's largest producers of crude oil. when you look at the history of California, of course, we all know about the gold rush and things like that. But and you sort of know about, the entertainment industry, a little bit about agriculture, and a lot about tech, right? But what honestly flowed underneath that and through that is oil in the state. So we first found oil in the late 1860s here, and the list is long. Gould's, Stanford, Doheny, Chandler's. They all, these are all dominant fortunes that were built through petroleum in California, and so the petroleum industry really did fund the growth of this state. And it funded agricultural growth too, because the petroleum was used for mechanization of agriculture in our state. So it has a long, great history there. We began in the late 1960s, we being the state, began a series of policies that began to slow down in-state production. That's called in-field production, right? Field production in-state oil. So we began a policy in the late 1960s, right around after the Santa Barbara oil incident offshore, which began limiting in-state production of oil. So our in-state production has fallen by 68%. However, our imports have grown by 712%. And so California now has sort of flip-flopped, where before we were pretty much independent of foreign oil. Today we are literally completely dependent. Now that's not 100%, but we import over 62% of our oil from foreign non-US sources. If we lose any of those sources, then you can imagine the consequences. The primary sources for the last decade have been Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Ecuador. Last year in 2024, Saudi oil imports fell, but Guyana imports increased, generally through, I believe, the shell production and the production of Chevron down there. And so, but we're heavily dependent on that. Meanwhile, we have tremendous oil reserves in the state of California that are untapped. And we have a lot of smaller independent operators who are very competent that are just really looking for the opportunity to contribute, a couple of 100,000 barrels of oil, which, unfortunately the state came back to me and said, well, if you added a couple million barrels of oil in production, it wouldn't bring the price down that much. Well, a little that much is add up to a big thing. So again, I think it's policy, but no, we're highly dependent on that. And now with the closure of these two refineries, we're going to be highly dependent on foreign gasoline. So we're going to be dependent on foreign oil and dependent on foreign gasoline. It's going to be a tough situation.
Professor Mische, I was wondering on this production point, I think California production now is sort of 250,000 barrels a day or somewhere in there, a little less than 300. What do you think it could be if the state really embraced the industry again and permitted it and let capital flow? Any sense of what that number would be?
I think you could easily get that number up to 1 million.
And the state could would make a lot of money in taxes, and a lot of things would come to them as
one
a
of our
result.
action points, yes, it would. One of our action points that we brought out in the paper was, one of our problems is supply. And the other problem is we're highly dependent on foreign oil. So maybe we could get the refiners to stay in the state if we rolled back some regulations on that. And the producers were given an investment tax credit to increase production in the state with the proviso, legislative statutory proviso, that whatever production they produce in California must go to a California refinery and must be made into California compliant gasoline and sold in California. And so, we were just looking for ways to incentivize refiners to stay in the state and also try to bring down the prices.
Can I ask you about California compliant gasoline? Because this is an interesting one. At some level, it's a very thoughtful we want the best gasoline, environmentally speaking, as we can have. On the other hand, the flip side of that is the rest of the country, for some reason, they're using a grade of gasoline that is just somehow not good enough for Californians. Like, what does it cost this segment alone to say we have to have our own special blend of gasoline? This is kind of one of the first things you heave overboard in the midst of a budget crisis.
Well, cost-wise, the special blend that we're currently using, it's estimated anywhere from 12 to 10 to 12, 15 cents a gallon extra onto the retail price of gasoline. And prices vary and things like that, but it's anywhere from 10 to 15 cents a gallon. Now, there's a history to the California special blend, and it's actually a valid history. The first recorded incident of smog in our state goes back in the 1940s. And then, of course, if you're a Californian, you remember the 1960s. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a Californian, but I have family that lived out here, and I remember visiting out here. And I wasn't sure whether I was in Pittsburgh or California at the time because the air quality was just atrocious in both cities. So the California Air Resources Board was passed under the Reagan administration. And so we began to see the first standards in place to help us reduce smog and emissions, and they've had a tremendous positive impact. The question is, what is the point of diminishing returns? Does further cost bring down an equivalent amount of pollution? Especially when you have to balance that between producing gasoline in state and importing it on ocean tankers from 40 days at sea from Asia. So the greenhouse gas emission effect may, and I'm not an expert in this, but may have reached a point of diminishing returns. Certainly with the potential passing or the implications of implementing the low carbon fuel standard number 2, which I believe is they're aiming for July 1st. CARB's own estimate was 47 cents a gallon at that point, but they retracted it because of public blowback. The latest is 10%, maybe 5%. Well, I have it anywhere from 57 to 63 cents a gallon. University of Pennsylvania has it above $1 a gallon. So, I think we are looking at a point of diminishing returns on this California special blend.
So and I think you just captured it, that question, are we past the point of diminishing returns? That really, because the 60s, you think of smog and you think of the oil spill in Santa Barbara, like that was a world that needed more regulation. But now we've gone so far, we're having unintended consequences. Can I ask you one other thing? Because you referenced this up front, which is, people do actually understand the implications of their policies, I think was sort of the theme we had. So by default, do you think that Sacramento understands that these policies are falling disproportionately on lower income people?
Well, I don't know how they could not understand that because.
Well, that's my question, but that's.
Every economist in the world is saying, look, it's disproportionate on working class families, disproportionate on senior citizens on fixed income, disproportionate on lower income folks, and disproportionate on those who are on benefits and subsidies, right? So it's highly disproportionate on those individuals. But I think that perhaps may be something that's inconvenient narrative at this point.
From an economic perspective, and just would love to get your view. There was a group of members of Newsom's administration that did some work on what it would take to keep refineries running in the state. And one of their proposals was that the state government could potentially take over the refineries. What's your view on that piece of work and that potential outcome?
Hilarious, preposterous, disastrous, pick an adjective. First of all, we have good examples, state-run refineries in Venezuela. So I mean that there is some precedent there. But think about it. If the state is running these refineries, then the state is going to be responsible for the massive amounts of capital that have to be invested in these refineries annually, not to mention every 5 years. So annually, there's a lot of capital that goes in for basic, relatively minor upgrades, some technology changes, a lot of maintenance and repairs. Every 4 or 5 years, there's a massive amount that goes in. It's equivalent to taking the engine out of a car, rebuilding it, and putting it back in. So is the state going to be in a financial position where it can fund the capital investments? Concern number one, doubtful. Number two, does the state have the business acumen to run a refinery? I mean, they can't build a railroad. I mean, how are they going to run a refinery? And are they going to make the refinery workers state employees? Are they going to keep the executives? I mean, how are they going to do that? Does a refinery executive who's been working for Chevron for 25, 30 years suddenly want to work for the state of California? Doubtful. But I mean, I guess that's possible, but doubtful. And then number three, when there's a refinery mishap, a fire, an unplanned shutdown, a disruption in supply, equipment malfunction, and prices spike, who's the state going to blame? And who are they going to find? Are they going to blame themselves? And they're going to fine themselves for refinery shutdowns and fires and unplanned, unscheduled type events? So the idea of the state taking over these refineries and having any competency to run them, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, there might be ways they can contract with these refineries to keep them in state, but a takeover of them, I think that's sheer folly.
Professor Mische, I was wondering if you tried to add up for the state all the costs of all of these energy policies, right? So you have and you point to it in your paper. There's, I think you said, hundreds of regulatory type hurdles, but all the regulatory apparatus, all the employees, all the taxation at the pump, all the costs to the citizenry of electricity, the cost of lost jobs. If you just added up this whole system and what the state of California sort of incurs as a tax as a result of this approach they have to energy, how big could that be, that number?
I don't know. I haven't studied it. I don't think anybody's studied it, but it's got to be in the billions. It just has to be. All right. I haven't studied. I'm just guessing. I can tell you what it is for a gallon of gas. All right. And that's about $1.64 a gallon plus 18 cents for the federal excise tax. But I can't tell you, at an aggregate level. But if you think about the amount of regulatory oversight that California has, and the amount of state employees that are associated with that regulatory oversight. Do you happen to know that number, the number of employees that are associated with the? I do not. It would be an interesting study if indeed you could get the numbers from the state.
Well, no, this is a kind of a crazy comment, but I'll throw it out at you. If that whole apparatus was just pushed overboard, okay, we're not spending that money anymore, we get all that money back, would there really be a change in the environmental quality of California? I think this is the part that's the hardest, because right now California tells itself, I'm imagining, there's a cost benefit here. I'm paying more, but I get the benefit, to our environment and, maybe to the globe, but certainly to our environment. Like, there's a cost benefit here. But the reality is there may be very little benefit that goes with this cost.
I would agree that I think we have reached the point of diminishing returns on the cost versus the benefit. The costs are going up and the benefits are becoming less and less and less. And those costs are passed on to the consumer. And they also serve as a disincentive for the operators in the state. So I think we are at that point. I would like to think that we have mindful operators, but there's always going to be some who aren't. So we always need some type of regulatory guardrails. That there's no question we need some regulatory guardrails. Do they have to be constructed the way they are today? I think that needs to take a serious look. I think it's probably time for almost a DOGE approach to California government. What's really needed? What's the return on investment to the California taxpayer? And what makes most common sense? And I think we need to sort of approach it like that. But do we need some regulatory controls? Absolutely. But for the most part, the operators that I know, these are mindful operators. We have the most sophisticated refineries in the world here in California, or some of them. They're ranked on this thing called the Nelson score, and ours rank higher than the national average and twice as high as Europe. And we have some of the best workforce, some of the best, highest trained, most competent workforce in Kern County, in places like that. And these are very smart, very conscientious workers, on the lines, in the fields, in the refineries. And so I think, we tend to over legislate that. But I think it's come now to the point where it's not an independent business perspective anymore from the state. It is more of ideological dogma. And so when you're dealing with ideological dogma, it doesn't really matter. They're just going to, it's they're right, you're wrong, and that's the way it is.
Professor, this has been such a fascinating discussion. I know we're running short on time, but I'd just love to ask you a slightly different set of questions here. And given your background advising the kingdom, can you give us some kind of inside look at how the Middle East thinks about investing in real assets in the U.S.? As we've seen over the last couple of years, particularly with the Trump administration, there's been an increased activity and presence from the Middle East into the U.S., and I'd just love to get your perspective.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I did consulting work for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia on something called Vision 2030, which is the diversification of the Saudi economy away from petroleum. And we identified 14 sectors. And so the results of that work was really to design organizational structures so that Saudi can invest money through this organizational structure into something called the Innovation Superhighway. And the Innovation Superhighway was designed to find non-petroleum sectors in the United States to invest in, and either build that technology here and keep it here and bring it back to Saudi Arabia, or incubate it here and bring it to Saudi Arabia, so that the Saudis could then put it into their economy and their infrastructure to diversify away from petroleum. So that program began in under the first Trump administration around 2017, late November. It was affected by COVID, and then it chilled under the Biden administration. But boy, it didn't take Trump long to bring back $600 billion from Saudi Arabia, and I think another 1.4 from Qatar and some of these other places. So the superhighway is being built. We'll see investment in the United States in robotic medicine, pharmaceuticals, a lot of AI, a lot of energy production for AI, and also entertainment and things like that. So that's what that was about, and we're starting to see the fruits of that labor now. It didn't take long after Trump got into office to bring that $600 billion back.
And Professor, I think about certain countries that have basically gone to the brink. I think of Colombia right now, where they basically have tried to get away from fossil fuels, and now they're importing natural gas. You look at Germany. Germany got away from nuclear. Now it looks like they're kind of making a U-turn on that. The UK got rid of their last coal plant. They seem to be making a U-turn. I guess my question is, we always try to ask guests, like, what are things going to look like in the next 10 years? And I guess using those examples of people going up to the brink and finally changing and going the opposite direction, what do you think things look like in the next 10 years here?
Actually, I think fossil fuels are going to be with us for a long, long time because we need them for other things. But I think for energy production, we're looking at small nuclear reactors. I think we'll see. I know that you had mentioned earlier about the executive orders on that, but I know that there are plans being drawn up in Washington now to strategically deploy those. So we'll see that. We'll also see, I think, great increase in our own liquid natural gas production here, captured here and then sold to the Europeans. We need a couple more pipelines for that, which I know the administration's working on. I think the Europeans will embrace small nuclear reactors as well. And so ultimately, it's just go to that. We need baseline sustainable energy production. As far as cars and mobility is concerned, I think the most viable transition technology right now are hybrids. But I ultimately think that sometime, hopefully I'll live long enough, that we'll see hydrogen cars as the primary propulsion system. But until we get there, we're going to harvest our fossil fuels and produce gasoline and products like that.
Well, Professor Mische, this has been tremendous. I'm so glad that John got the question in on the Saudis, because that was a fascinating assignment. Last question, just structurally, when you think about solving this, because Mike and I were visiting with a power executive this morning who commented on how when we start mixing politics with power system design, you get bad results. And so some of these technical engineering cost, finance type questions arguably are not left best in the hands of politicians. Do you think there's a way, if in California, if Gavin Newsom said, I'm going to ask these 10 reasonable people to come back to me with their recommendations on how to reform California's energy system, and you pulled it out of the Sacramento political kind of hotbed, is that a way forward here? Could that then, I'm assuming if you asked a tech executive who sat down for a few months and was part of an orderly study of all this, that they would come to the same conclusions you're coming to. Is there an answer in here along those lines?
Well, I think, if Governor Newsom was mindful and not such an ideologue about the current policy and a defender of the current policy, if I could talk to him, I'd say, look, you don't have to believe me. I'm just an academic. I do the research paper, but really, why don't we convene the top executives from the producers and the refiners, and just say, look, what will it take to get you to stay here? How would you like to operate profitably? And how, what would be a reasonable migration path for you out of the state? Not 2035, you're out. What would be reasonable for you? Now, I think a lot of executives and clients that I've had the opportunity to advise, and graciously, great opportunities, would follow that approach. They would reach out into the people who are most responsible and who are the best minds and own their companies and operate their companies, and say, what will it take for you to do certain things? But I don't think we have that level of collaboration built in the state of California now, given all the regulatory and the vitriol that have occurred between the industry and Sacramento. Could a bridge be made? Of course, bridges can always be made. but I think there's just been an awful lot of just bad relationships built
Yeah.
over the past decade in particular.
Is there also just an installed base of, when you think of like the regulators, all the people involved in this whole system? I mean, there must be tens of thousands of people who don't want to see this system go away.
Well, of course, it's their paycheck. It's what they do. Their existence is to regulate and to control. They have a vested interest in maintaining sort of that balance of power. But I can't believe at this point it's in the best interest of California to maintain the status quo.
Well, it's a great piece of work. If you don't mind, we'll attach it when we send out this podcast. Even though it's big, it's digestible, particularly like the executive summary and the abstract. So we hope more people read your work. It's great. It's a great scholarly endeavor. So thank you for doing it.
Well, no, thank you for having me. I truly appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we hope you'll come see us in Houston as well. Even better, we'll come see you in California. For all this talk about energy, it is the most beautiful place on the planet. So
it is, but I would suspect that Governor Newsom would buy me a one-way ticket to Houston. So
all right.
I may see you first.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Mische. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great day.
Bye-bye. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.